Well, as we begin to look at identity in the self and how it's formed and how we understand it, I do want to provide a little bit of background because many people, when they conceptualize identity in their selves and how they view themselves, they see it as being something static, that is something that doesn't change. And many times you hear people talk about their real selves or their authentic selves. And as we study identity and self, most of the time as we view it, we're viewing it as something that is very dynamic, it changes over time, and it is multifaceted. And the analogy that's used to understand the multifaceted nature of our identities is that to a crystal. And if you've ever seen a crystal before and you hold it up to the light, it refracts light differently based on its angles, and you can see different colors, and it's absolutely beautiful. But depending on how you're holding it, you're going to see a completely different view. Well, our identity is much like that in that we are multidimensional. We have many different facets to our own selves, many different aspects to our own personalities, and that's why it takes someone a very long time to get to know us very intimately and to know all the different facets of ourselves, even though we can't truly be completely known by another person or by ourselves, and we'll study that as we look at the Johari window later in the semester. In Stuart Zedeker and Whitbourne's chapter on identity, found in Stuart's interpersonal textbook, I really like how they identify 4 main aspects of identity that helps us to better understand how our identity is formed and just understand how it progresses and how we can better learn about ourselves. First, they say that identity is multidimensional and it's dynamic, it's changing. You shouldn't view it as being something static. You're not going to be the same person you are your entire life, and thankfully so. I think about how I was in high school, and I'm so glad that I've grown up since then. So we are definitely changing. Secondly, who we are responds to different social contexts, and we react and we connect to our environments and to people within those environments, and it affects who we are and we affect those environments. So that interdependent relationship through response is a very important aspect of our identity. Thirdly, ourselves and our conception of self is going to develop in the past and present relationships. That is, your past relationships have an impact on who you see yourself as, and that's why the family is so important. And as people study family relationships, it has a big impact on children's self-esteem, and those past relationships have an impact on how you see yourself, but also your present relationships do as well. And then fourthly and finally, the self is what we call avowed and ascribed. It is avowed in the sense that we develop our own sense of self and we present it to others around us. But it's also ascribed in that other people ascribe us identities. They identify what they deem to be our identity, and we may or may not agree with it at times. And you might have had someone who maybe called you a name or referred to you in a certain way, or maybe said that you had a certain personality trait and you just didn't agree with them. You didn't agree with what they ascribed to you. And that's fine. We have to understand that self is both avowed and ascribed. As we better understand our identities, there's an interesting segment in your textbook in Chapter 2 called Spotlight on Scholarship, and it discusses the interdependent identity frames identified by Hesch. And I think this is really interesting if you have a chance to read through it. It talks about a personal frame and enactment frame, a relational frame and a communal frame. And these really are interdependent in the sense that you don't just have one or the other, and just because you have a personal frame doesn't mean that it acts independently over here. It actually affects your enactment frame, your relational frames, and your communal frames, and vice versa. Your personal frame is your self-knowledge, your self-assessment, and even maybe a sense of spiritual self. Your enactment frame is who you act yourself out as in your communication, how you present yourself. Your relational frame is how you negotiate your identity within relationships. Really interesting. For example, when you look at a marriage and when people get married and how they see themselves very differently within that marriage and that relational frame. and it's affected by how people outside the relationship view marriage and whether or not they accept those views or reject those views, and then how they conceptualize marriage themselves and negotiate it between one another, and what the roles are of the marriage relationship. And then fourthly, you have a communal frame. And that's group identity and how members of a group identify with one another. And this can be very interesting, and you can study a communal frame in terms of small groups like friendship networks, or you could study it in terms of an organization you belong to. It probably, many of you joined certain organizations when you came to SFA based on maybe the values, purpose of the organization. So you could probably understand that communal frame very well from your own organizational experiences. Now, when we start to look at the identity and self, there are a lot of vocabulary words. You're just not going to get around it. Make yourself some nice little index cards and review those before the test. But as you look at how your self-concept, that is your idea or image of self, what we almost refer to as self-identity, how it's formed, you need to understand that it's affected by your self-perceptions and others' reactions and responses to you. Now, self-perception is through our experiences. We're going to develop our own sense of our skills, our abilities, our knowledge, our competencies, and our personality. For example, you take a math class and it's really challenging, but you feel like you're able to accomplish it and you perform well, and so you deem that you have good math skills by the end of the semester because you get a good grade in the class. Well, that's through your experiences and your self-perception. But also, you have other people's reactions to you and your responses to you that are going to affect how you're going to view your skills, your abilities, your knowledge, and your competencies. And self-esteem comes when you make that overall evaluation of your competence and personal worthiness in maybe a certain area or overall. And it's rooted in what you deem as being worthwhile. And so, for example, if math is a subject that's really important to you and you perform well in that class, then it might boost your overall evaluation of yourself and your competence just because you performed well in there. However, if it's not a class that you hold very valuable to your future profession, and it's not something that you want to use in the future, so you don't give it a lot of worthiness, then the fact that you performed well in there might actually not affect your self-esteem whatsoever, because it's based on what you deem as worthwhile. And the greater the gap between our ideal self and our perceived self is going to usually lead to lower self-esteem. And that's why when we have really unrealistic expectations of an ideal, then there's no way we can meet that ideal. And people are going to have lower self-esteem because of that. And you probably have heard this related to body image quite frequently. There's a lot of criticism that the media gets from the way that it portrays the woman's body, because in many cases you see a very unrealistic ideal that is shown in magazine pages and television shows and so forth, and in all advertisements they're airbrushed anyway, but that unrealistic ideal is oftentimes criticized for what leads to a lot of young women's very low self-esteem and unrealistic body images. So those are some basic terms related to identity and self, but you also have your roles that are going to influence how you construct your view of self. And you wear many different hats, which are your roles in life. You are a child of someone. You may be a sibling. You are a student in this class. You may have a job, so you could be an employee. You have so many different roles. And a student is just one of them, and it's kind of a good example to use, but your conceptions of an ideal student are going to affect how you perform as a student, what you think you should be doing as a student, and it's going to affect your overall judgment. And if you have a large gap in between what your ideal is and how you're performing, and your ideal may be unrealistic possibly, then you're going to have lower self-esteem if that's what you deem to be very worthwhile. And if you don't, then it may not affect your self-esteem whatsoever, but you can understand how your roles are going to influence your construction of self and how you also esteem yourself. And we engage in something called self-monitoring, which is also referred to as reflexivity, and it's the internal process of being aware of yourself and how you're coming across to others. And that is, you see yourself, you evaluate yourself. How many times have you gone home after a conversation and thought, why did I say that? Or why did I do that? That just didn't fit the situation. Or I wish I would have said this instead. And you're engaging right then and there in some self-monitoring behavior. And we do that because we're aware of ourselves. We're aware of what we're doing and what we're saying.